My mom took my house and gave it to my brother. 2 years later she lived in mine. I never thought my own mother would steal from me. That's a strong word, I know, steal. But what else do you call it when someone takes something that's rightfully yours and hands it to someone else without your permission, without even a conversation? That's exactly what happened to me, and the person who did it was the woman who gave birth to me, who raised me, who I thought would always have my back. Let me take you back to where this all started. I grew up in Denver, Colorado, in a modest 3-bedroom house in the Highlands neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, but it was home. My father died when I was 12, leaving my mother, my younger brother Tyler, and me to figure out life without him. My mother, Patricia, worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat: secretary during the day, waitress at night. I watched her sacrifice everything for us, and I promised myself that one day I'd take care of her the way she'd taken care of us. Tyler was 4 years younger than me, and from the moment he was born he had this ability to charm everyone around him. He was funny, charismatic, always knew the right thing to say. While I was the serious one, the responsible one who got good grades and helped with bills as soon as I was old enough to work, Tyler was the fun one, the one who made mom laugh after her long shifts. I didn't resent it back then. He was my little brother and I loved him. After high school I went to community college while working full-time at a hardware store. I studied business administration because I wanted to build something stable, something secure. Tyler, on the other hand, dropped out of high school in his senior year, chasing dreams of becoming a musician. He'd play guitar at local bars, crash on friends' couches, live that bohemian lifestyle that mom somehow found endearing rather than concerning. By the time I was 26, I'd worked my way up to assistant manager at a home improvement chain. I'd saved every penny I could, living in a tiny studio apartment that barely had room for a bed and a kitchenette. I ate ramen more nights than I care to remember. I didn't go out, didn't take vacations, didn't buy anything unnecessary. Every dollar went into my savings account because I had a goal. I was going to buy a house. It took me 8 years of grinding, but I finally had enough for a down payment. I found a small 2-bedroom bungalow in Aurora. Nothing fancy but solid, with good bones and a yard. The day I got the keys I called my mother, expecting her to be proud. She congratulated me, but her voice sounded distant, distracted. I should have recognized that tone, but I was too excited to notice the warning signs. I spent 6 months fixing up that house. Every weekend, every evening after work I was there, painting walls, refinishing hardwood floors, updating the bathroom, planting flowers in the front yard. I poured my heart into that place because it represented everything I'd worked for, every sacrifice I'd made. It was proof that the responsible path paid off, that delayed gratification had meaning. My mother came to visit once during those 6 months. She walked through the rooms with this strange expression I couldn't quite read. She touched the walls I'd painted, looked at the kitchen I'd renovated with my own hands, stood in the backyard where I'd built a small patio. She told me I'd done a nice job, but something in her eyes felt off, like she was calculating something I couldn't see. Tyler, meanwhile, was 32 and still bouncing between gigs and couches. His music career hadn't gone anywhere. He'd been in and out of relationships, in and out of jobs, never seeming to gain any traction in life. Mom would call me regularly, hinting that I should help him out, maybe let him stay with me for a while until he got on his feet. I always had an excuse ready. The house was too small, I needed my space, he needed to figure things out on his own. Then came the day that changed everything. My mother called and asked me to come over to her apartment. She said she needed to discuss something important about my father's estate. I was confused because Dad had died 14 years ago, and I didn't think there was any estate left to discuss. But I went, curious and completely unprepared for what was coming. She sat me down at her kitchen table, the same table where we'd eaten countless meals as a family. She poured coffee with shaking hands, and that's when I knew something was very wrong. She told me that when my father died, he'd left a small life insurance policy that she'd never mentioned to me or Tyler. She'd invested the money and over the years it had grown. She said she'd always planned to split it between us, to give us each something to help us build our lives. But then she said something that made my blood run cold. She told me that she'd decided to give Tyler my house. Not sell it to him, not help him buy his own place. Give him my house, the one I'd bought with my own money, the one I'd spent months renovating with my own hands. She said Tyler needed it more than I did, that I was established and stable while he was struggling. She said she'd used the insurance money to pay off my mortgage without telling me, which meant technically she owned the house now. And as the owner, she was transferring the deed to Tyler. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what I was hearing. My mother had paid off my mortgage without my knowledge or consent, then claimed ownership of my house so she could give it to my brother. It was insane, possibly illegal, definitely immoral. I asked her how she'd even done it, how she'd accessed my mortgage information. She admitted she'd forged my signature on documents, used information she'd gotten when she'd visited the house. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about the house or the money. It was about everything those things represented. I'd spent 8 years sacrificing, working, saving, building something with my own hands while Tyler had drifted through life without consequences. And now my mother was rewarding his irresponsibility by stealing from me, by taking what I'd earned and handing it to him on a silver platter. I stood up from that table, my hands shaking with rage and hurt. I asked her if she understood what she was doing, if she realized she was destroying our relationship over this. She started crying, saying she knew I'd be upset but that I'd understand eventually, that Tyler needed this chance and I was strong enough to start over. She actually said that, I was strong enough to start over, as if that made it okay to rob me of years of work. I walked out of her apartment that day and didn't look back. I contacted a lawyer immediately, explaining the situation. He told me I had grounds for a lawsuit, that what she'd done was fraud. But he also warned me that fighting it would be expensive, time-consuming, and would permanently destroy what was left of my family. I had to decide what mattered more, the house or the relationships. I spent 2 weeks agonizing over that decision. Part of me wanted to fight to make them understand how wrong this was. But another part of me realized something important. I didn't want that house anymore. It was tainted now, poisoned by betrayal. Every room would remind me of what my mother had done, of how little she valued my hard work compared to Tyler's comfort. So I made a choice that surprised even me. I let them have it. I signed papers releasing any claim to the property, making it clean and legal. But I also cut off contact with both of them completely. No phone calls, no visits, no explanations. They'd made their choice and now I was making mine. Tyler moved into my house 2 weeks later. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Mom had thrown him a housewarming party, celebrating his good fortune like he'd earned it himself. The image of them celebrating in the rooms I'd painted, on the floors I'd refinished, in the yard where I'd built that patio with my own hands, it burned into my mind like a brand. I moved into a cramped apartment in a not great part of town, starting over from scratch at 34 years old. I'd lost my house, my savings, and my family in one devastating blow. But as I unpacked my few belongings in that tiny apartment, I made myself a promise. I would rebuild and I would never, ever let anyone take from me again. The first few months after losing the house were the darkest period of my life. I'd wake up in that cramped apartment, stare at the water-stained ceiling, and feel the weight of betrayal pressing down on my chest like a physical thing. Some mornings I could barely get out of bed. The anger and hurt would cycle through me in waves. Rage at my mother for what she'd done, fury at Tyler for accepting stolen property, and perhaps worst of all, shame at myself for not fighting harder, for letting them win. But somewhere around month 3 something shifted inside me. I was sitting in my car during my lunch break, eating a sandwich and watching people stream in and out of the store where I worked, when I realized I had a choice. I could let this destroy me, could spend the rest of my life bitter and broken, or I could use it as fuel. My mother had bet that I was strong enough to start over. Well, I'd prove her right, but not in the way she'd meant it. I wouldn't just survive this. I'd thrive despite it. I started working overtime every chance I got, picking up extra shifts, volunteering for projects no one else wanted. The store manager noticed my increased dedication and asked if I'd be interested in training for a regional position. It meant more responsibility, more hours, but also significantly more money. I said yes without hesitation. I had nothing else in my life demanding my time or energy. No family dinners, no weekend visits with Mom, no helping Tyler move for the 15th time. All that freed up emotional space could go into building something new. Within 6 months, I'd been promoted to regional training coordinator, traveling between different store locations across Colorado and Wyoming, teaching management techniques and operational efficiency. The salary increase was substantial, nearly double what I'd been making. I moved into a better apartment, nothing fancy but clean and safe, in a neighborhood where I didn't hear sirens every night. I also started educating myself about real estate law, property rights, and asset protection. What my mother had done to me had exposed my ignorance about how to protect what was mine. I wasn't going to let that happen again. I read books, took online courses, consulted with lawyers about setting up trusts and proper documentation. Knowledge became my armor against future betrayal. Through my work travels, I started noticing patterns in different communities. Which neighborhoods were growing, where new developments were planned, which areas had potential for appreciation. I began researching real estate markets obsessively, studying trends, learning to identify opportunities. If I was going to rebuild my life, I'd do it smarter this time, with better strategies and stronger protections. About a year after the betrayal, I heard through the grapevine that things weren't going well for Tyler. Apparently, owning a house came with responsibilities he hadn't anticipated. Property taxes, homeowners insurance, maintenance costs, utility bills. The free ride my mother had given him wasn't quite as simple as just living there. He'd had to get a real job, something stable enough to cover the expenses, which meant giving up his musician lifestyle. The irony wasn't lost on me. I also heard that he and Mom had gotten into arguments about the house. She'd apparently expected some kind of gratitude, maybe for him to let her move in with him eventually. But Tyler had started treating the house like it was truly his, making decisions without consulting her, even telling her she couldn't just drop by whenever she wanted. The dynamic between them was fracturing, and I felt a grim satisfaction at that news. They'd betrayed me together. Let them deal with the consequences together. But I didn't dwell on their problems. I was too focused on my own progress. By the 18-month mark, I'd saved enough for another down payment, this time with a much larger emergency fund as backup. I'd also gotten another promotion, moving into a position as director of operations for a cluster of stores across 3 states. The job came with a substantial salary increase, and more importantly, it came with respect. People listened when I spoke. My ideas mattered. My competence was recognized and rewarded. I started seriously house hunting again, but this time I was smarter, more strategic. I wasn't just looking for a place to live. I was looking for an investment, something that would appreciate, something in an up-and-coming neighborhood. I spent months researching, visiting properties, analyzing comps and market trends. Then I found it. A foreclosure in the Berkeley neighborhood of Denver, just a few blocks from where I'd grown up. The house was a disaster, a 3-bedroom craftsman that had been abandoned and neglected. The yard was overgrown, the interior was trashed, pipes had frozen and burst. Most buyers walked through and immediately walked out. But I saw past the damage to the bones underneath. Solid construction, good location, massive potential. I bought it for a fraction of what it would be worth once renovated. And then I got to work, but this time I was smarter about it. I hired professionals for the major systems, plumbing, electrical, HVAC, things that needed to be done right. But I still did a lot of the cosmetic work myself, spending evenings and weekends transforming that wreck into something beautiful. This time, the renovation wasn't just about creating a home, it was about proving something to myself. Every wall I repaired, every fixture I installed, every room I transformed was evidence that I could rebuild from nothing. The house became a metaphor for my own resurrection, rising from the ashes of betrayal into something stronger and more beautiful than before. I documented everything meticulously, every receipt, every permit, every contractor agreement. I set up an LLC to hold the property, created a trust with ironclad protections. This house would be legally bulletproof. No one would ever be able to take it from me the way my mother had taken the last one. The neighborhood was gentrifying rapidly. Young professionals were moving in, coffee shops and restaurants were opening, property values were climbing. I'd timed the market perfectly. Within 6 months of buying the foreclosure, comparable houses on my street were selling for 50% more than what I'd paid. My investment was already paying off. As I neared the 2-year mark since the betrayal, I realized I'd not only recovered from what they'd done to me, I'd surpassed where I'd been before. My new house was in a better neighborhood than the one they'd stolen. My career had advanced beyond anything I'd imagined possible. My financial situation was stronger, my knowledge was deeper, my protections were tighter. I'd cut off all contact with my mother and Tyler, blocked their numbers, avoided places where I might run into them. As far as I was concerned, they were strangers who'd once known me. I had no interest in reconciliation, no desire to hear apologies or explanations. They'd made their choices and I'd made mine. But life has a funny way of bringing things full circle. Just as I was finishing the renovation on my new house, just as I was settling into this new, stronger version of myself, my phone rang with a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was a social worker from Denver Health Medical Center. She was calling about Patricia Chin, my mother. There'd been an incident, she said, and I was listed as the emergency contact. My mother was in the hospital, and according to the social worker, she had nowhere to go when she was discharged. I stood in my newly renovated kitchen holding that phone, feeling like the universe had just delivered the strangest twist of irony imaginable. My mother, who'd stolen my house to give to my brother, now needed a place to live. And the only person left to help her was me, standing in a house that was better and more secure than anything she'd taken from me. The social worker was still talking, explaining the situation, asking if I could come to the hospital. I looked around at my beautiful new home, at everything I'd built from the ruins of betrayal, and I realized I had a decision to make. One that would define what kind of person I'd become through all of this. I drove to Denver Health Medical Center in a daze, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. 2 years. It had been 2 years since I'd seen or spoken to my mother, 2 years since she'd looked me in the eye and told me she was giving my house to Tyler. And now, somehow, she was in a hospital with nowhere to go, and I was the emergency contact she'd never bothered to remove from her paperwork. The social worker met me in the waiting area of the emergency department. Her name was Karen, and she had that particular expression of weary compassion that comes from seeing too many family dramas play out in sterile hospital hallways. She explained that my mother had collapsed at work. She was still waitressing at 62 years old, still working nights to make ends meet. They'd run tests and discovered she had uncontrolled diabetes and dangerously high blood pressure. She'd been neglecting her health for years, apparently, letting conditions worsen because she couldn't afford proper medical care and was too proud to ask for help. But that wasn't the worst part. Karen explained that my mother had been evicted from her apartment 3 weeks ago. She'd been sleeping in her car, showing up at the restaurant each night to work her shift, then parking in various lots around the city to sleep. The stress, combined with inadequate nutrition and lack of medication, had caused her to collapse during her shift. A coworker had called the ambulance. I asked about Tyler, about why he wasn't here, why he couldn't help. Karen's expression told me she'd already asked the same question. She said my mother had refused to provide his contact information, had insisted on them calling me instead. When Karen pressed, my mother had finally admitted that she and Tyler weren't speaking, that there'd been a falling out, that he'd made it clear he didn't want her in his life. The irony was almost too perfect to be real. My mother had destroyed our relationship to give Tyler everything, and now Tyler had thrown her away like she was nothing. The house she'd stolen from me to give to him hadn't bought her the gratitude or security she'd been hoping for. Instead, it had cost her both of her children. Karen led me through the emergency department to a small room where my mother lay in a hospital bed, connected to N4, looking 20 years older than the last time I'd seen her. Her hair had gone completely gray. Her face was gaunt, lined with exhaustion and stress. When she saw me, her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. What could she possibly say? I stood at the foot of her bed, maintaining distance, keeping my emotional walls firmly in place. I asked her what happened with Tyler, why she was sleeping in her car instead of living in the house she'd given him. She closed her eyes, tears streaming down her cheeks, and told me a story that was somehow both shocking and completely predictable. Tyler had started dating someone about 6 months after moving into the house. A woman named Brianna who apparently had strong opinions about everything, including Tyler's family. She'd convinced him that my mother was manipulative, that the gift of the house came with strings attached, that he needed to establish boundaries. Tyler, always easily influenced by whoever was in his orbit, had embraced this narrative enthusiastically. When my mother had asked if she could move into the spare bedroom, the house had 2 bedrooms after all, and she was struggling financially, Tyler had refused. He'd told her the house was his now, that she'd given it to him freely, and that he didn't owe her anything. When she'd pointed out that she'd sacrificed her financial security to give him that house, he'd accused her of trying to guilt him, of being toxic and controlling. The relationship had deteriorated rapidly from there. Tyler had eventually told her to stop contacting him, that he needed space to live his own life without her interference. And my mother, who'd destroyed her relationship with me to secure Tyler's future, found herself utterly alone. She couldn't afford her apartment on a waitress salary without the insurance money she'd spent on Tyler's house. She'd fallen behind on rent, gotten evicted, and had been too ashamed to reach out to me after everything she'd done. I listened to all of this with a strange detachment, like I was hearing about characters in a sad story rather than my own family. Part of me felt vindicated. She was finally experiencing the consequences of her choices, finally understanding what it felt like to be cast aside by the people you'd sacrificed for. But another part of me, a part one didn't want to acknowledge, just felt tired. This wasn't the triumphant revenge I might have fantasized about. It was just sad and pathetic and wasteful. The doctor came in while I was still there, explaining that my mother would need to stay hospitalized for a few more days while they stabilized her blood sugar and blood pressure. After that, she'd need a place to stay where someone could monitor her medication and ensure she was eating properly. She'd need follow-up appointments, ongoing treatment, lifestyle changes. She couldn't just go back to sleeping in her car and working night shifts. The doctor looked at me expectantly, assuming I'd step in, that this was what family did. I felt the weight of that expectation, felt everyone in the room waiting for me to say I'd take care of her. But I just stood there, silent, thinking about everything she'd taken from me, everything I'd had to rebuild, the 2 years of silence and separation. My mother finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. She said she didn't expect me to help her, that she knew she'd destroyed any right to my support. She said she'd figure something out, maybe a shelter or a social services program. She said she was sorry, that she'd made a terrible mistake, that she'd chosen wrong and had lost everything because of it. She said she understood if I walked away that she deserved it. And there it was. The apology I'd never gotten 2 years ago, the acknowledgement of wrongdoing, the admission that she'd ruined everything for nothing. It should have felt satisfying, but instead it just felt hollow. What was I supposed to do with an apology now, after I'd already rebuilt my entire life around her absence? I told her I needed time to think, that I wouldn't make any decisions while standing in a hospital room. Karen gave me her card, asking me to call within 48 hours to let them know what support I could provide, if any. I took the card and left, walking through those fluorescent-lit hallways in a fog of conflicting emotions. I drove home to my beautiful renovated house, the one I'd bought and restored with my own money and effort, the one that was legally protected in ways the first house never had been. I walked through rooms that reflected my taste, my choices, my hard work. This was the life I'd built from the ashes of betrayal, the proof that I didn't need them, that I could thrive without family support or approval. But as I sat in my living room that evening, staring at walls I'd painted myself, I couldn't escape the question that kept circling through my mind. My mother had made a terrible choice 2 years ago, one that had cost me dearly and ultimately cost her everything. She'd bet on the wrong child, destroyed our relationship, and ended up abandoned by both of us. Now she was sick, homeless, and desperate with nowhere to turn. I had every right to walk away, to let her face the consequences of her actions without my intervention. I'd earned my distance, my peace, my right to live without the people who'd hurt me. No one could blame me for saying no, for protecting the life I'd worked so hard to rebuild. But having the right to do something and actually doing it are two different things. As I sat there in the silence of my empty house, I had to confront an uncomfortable truth. The person I'd become over the past 2 years, strong, independent, successful, that person had the luxury of making a choice that the broken person from 2 years ago couldn't have made. I could afford to be generous now. I could afford to help without it costing me everything. The question wasn't whether she deserved my help. The question was what kind of person I wanted to be, what I wanted to see when I looked in the mirror, whether I wanted to define myself by my worst moments or my best ones. I picked up my phone and stared at Karen's card for a long time, feeling the weight of a decision that would reshape everything once again. Whatever I chose would define not just my mother's future, but my own character, my own story, the ultimate meaning of everything I'd been through. The choice was entirely mine, and for the first time in this whole terrible saga, I held all the power. The question was what I'd do with it. I called Karen the next morning and told her I'd take my mother in, but with conditions. This wouldn't be some sentimental reconciliation where we pretended the past hadn't happened. This would be a practical arrangement with clear boundaries, documented agreements, and realistic expectations. Karen sounded relieved, maybe even a little surprised. She'd probably seen enough family dramas to expect me to walk away. I spent the next 3 days preparing. I converted my home office into a bedroom, buying a bed, dresser, and basic necessities. I set up a medication organizer, researched diabetic meal plans, scheduled follow-up appointments with doctors. I approached it the same way I approached everything else in my life. Methodically, efficiently, with clear objectives and measurable outcomes. If I was going to do this, I'd do it right, but I'd do it on my terms. The day I brought my mother home from the hospital, the irony of the situation wasn't lost on either of us. She walked slowly through the house I'd renovated, taking in the hardwood floors I'd refinished, the kitchen I'd modernized, the careful design choices that reflected my taste and effort. This house was bigger than the one she'd taken from me, in a better neighborhood worth significantly more. I'd not only recovered from her betrayal, I'd surpassed what I'd lost. I showed her to her room and laid out the ground rules. She'd contribute what she could afford toward household expenses once she was well enough to work again, though I made it clear I didn't need her money. She'd take her medications on schedule, attend all medical appointments, and follow the treatment plan. We'd coexist civilly, but I wasn't promising warmth or forgiveness. This was a practical arrangement to keep her off the streets and healthy, nothing more. My mother accepted every condition without argument. She seemed smaller somehow, diminished by everything that had happened. The woman who'd confidently stolen my house and given it away was gone, replaced by someone uncertain and grateful for scraps of kindness. I felt no satisfaction in seeing her reduced this way. Victory, I discovered, doesn't taste as sweet as you imagine it will when you're drowning in anger. The first few weeks were awkward and tense. We moved around each other carefully, exchanging necessary pleasantries but little else. I'd go to work, she'd stay home resting and recovering. I'd make dinner, we'd eat in silence or with stilted conversation about neutral topics. The weather, a news story, nothing that mattered. At night, I'd retreat to my room and she'd retreat to hers, two strangers sharing a space out of necessity rather than choice. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to shift. My mother started doing small things around the house. Washing dishes, folding laundry, tidying up. She'd have coffee ready when I came down in the mornings. She'd leave thank you notes for groceries I'd bought or rides I'd given to appointments. She wasn't trying to earn forgiveness exactly. It felt more like she was trying to demonstrate that she understood the value of what I was giving her, that she didn't take it for granted. About 6 weeks after she'd moved in, we were sitting at the dinner table when she asked if I'd heard anything about Tyler. I hadn't, and I said so. She nodded slowly, then told me that Brianna had left him about a month ago, apparently moving on to someone with better prospects. Tyler had been calling Mom's old phone number, the one that no longer worked, leaving voicemails she couldn't retrieve. A former coworker had tracked her down to let her know. I asked if she wanted to reach out to him. She shook her head and said no. She told me that giving Tyler that house had been the biggest mistake of her life, not because of what it cost her financially, but because of what it revealed about both of them. She'd enabled his worst tendencies, rewarded his irresponsibility, and taught him that charm mattered more than character. And he'd proven himself to be exactly the person she'd shaped him into. Someone who took what he wanted and discarded people once they were no longer useful. It was the most honest conversation we'd had since she'd moved in, maybe the most honest conversation we'd ever had. I told her that what she'd done to me 2 years ago had nearly destroyed me, that I'd spent months feeling like I was drowning in betrayal and loss. But I also told her that it had forced me to become stronger, more capable, more self-reliant. I'd built something real from that pain, something that couldn't be taken away. She listened without defending herself, without making excuses. When I finished, she simply said she was sorry, that she'd let favoritism and misguided love blind her to what was right. She said she'd spent 2 years paying for that mistake and would probably spend the rest of her life regretting it. But she also said she was grateful I'd become strong enough to survive her failure as a mother, even though I shouldn't have had to. That conversation didn't fix everything. Wounds that deep don't heal with one honest discussion. But it cracked open a door that had been sealed shut for 2 years. We started actually talking, cautiously at first, then with increasing openness. She told me about the months she'd spent sleeping in her car, the shame and fear that had consumed her. I told her about the depression I'd fought through, the nights I'd questioned my own worth, the slow process of rebuilding my self-esteem. My mother found a part-time job at a local library, something less physically demanding than waitressing. She started contributing to household expenses, insisting on paying her way even though I told her it wasn't necessary. She attended every medical appointment, took her medications religiously, started walking around the neighborhood for exercise. She was taking responsibility for herself in ways she never had before. Around the 4-month mark, something unexpected happened. I came home from work to find my mother in the kitchen, crying over a letter. She'd received notice that the house, my old house that she'd given to Tyler, was in foreclosure. Tyler had apparently stopped making the property tax payments, had let the homeowner's insurance lapse, had taken out a home equity loan that he'd defaulted on. The bank was taking the house and they were notifying her as the previous owner of record. Everything she'd sacrificed, everything she'd stolen from me and given to him, was being lost anyway. The house would be auctioned off to pay Tyler's debts. He'd essentially destroyed in 2 years what had taken me 8 years to build. The poetic justice was almost too perfect, but seeing my mother's devastation at this news, I felt no triumph. Just a profound sadness at the waste of it all. I sat down next to her at the kitchen table and let her cry. When she finally composed herself, she looked at me with red-rimmed eyes and said something that surprised me. She said she deserved this, that this was the universe's way of showing her that you can't build anything lasting on betrayal and unfairness. She said the house was never really Tyler's because he hadn't earned it and you can't keep what you haven't earned. That night, I lay awake thinking about everything that had happened over the past 2 years. My mother had made a terrible choice that had cost me my home and her everything. Tyler had proven himself to be exactly as selfish and irresponsible as his behavior had always suggested. And I had been forced to rebuild from nothing, to become stronger and more capable than I'd ever imagined possible. The house I'd worked so hard for was gone, lost to foreclosure and Tyler's incompetence. But I'd built something better. The house I lived in now, the one I shared with my recovering mother, was superior in every way, bigger, nicer, more valuable and most importantly, truly and irrevocably mine in ways the first house never could have been. My mother eventually moved out after about 8 months, once she was stable and healthy and had saved enough for a small apartment of her own. Our relationship remained complicated. We weren't close in the traditional sense, but there was respect there now and a cautious affection. We had dinner together once a week, talked on the phone occasionally. She'd made amends to the extent that was possible, and I'd demonstrated that I could be the bigger person without letting myself be walked on again. I never heard from Tyler directly, though I heard through the grapevine that he'd moved back in with friends, was back to his old patterns of drifting and dreaming. The foreclosure had apparently taught him nothing. Some people never learn, never grow, never take responsibility. He'd been handed everything and squandered it, proving that my mother's investment in him had been as foolish as it was unfair. As for me, I eventually met someone, a woman named Rebecca who worked in hospital administration. We met at a medical supply conference where I was presenting on operational efficiency. She had her own story of family complications and hard-won independence. We understood each other in ways that people with easier lives couldn't. 2 years after meeting, she moved into my house, the one I'd built from the ruins of betrayal. Sometimes I drive past my old neighborhood in Aurora, past the street where that first house stood. I never stop, never drive down that actual street, but I think about it sometimes. That house represented the old me, naive, trusting, unprepared for the ways family could hurt you. It was fitting somehow that it was gone now, foreclosed and sold off to strangers. The house I live in now represents something different. Strength, resilience, wisdom earned through pain. My mother didn't just take my house 2 years ago. She inadvertently gave me something more valuable. The knowledge that I could lose everything and still rebuild, that I was capable of more than I'd ever imagined, that I didn't need anyone's approval or support to create a meaningful life. She lives in her modest apartment now, managing her health, working her library job, living quietly with the consequences of her choices. We're not estranged anymore, but we're not the family we might have been if she'd made different choices. That relationship was another casualty of her decision, something that can never be fully restored. Tyler is out there somewhere, probably still charming his way through life, still avoiding responsibility, still expecting things to work out without effort. The house that was supposed to secure his future is gone, sold at auction to pay his debts. He has nothing to show for the betrayal that bought him that false security. Me. I have everything I built with my own hands, protected with knowledge earned through loss, strengthened by adversity I never asked for but somehow survived. My mother took my house and gave it to my brother. 2 years later she lived in mine. Not as an owner, not as someone with power over me, but as someone I chose to help because I was strong enough to be generous. That choice, that ability to help her without losing myself was the real victory. Not revenge, not vindication, but the freedom to choose kindness from a position of strength rather than weakness. The house was never really the point. The point was becoming someone who couldn't be broken even by the people who should have protected me. I won, but not in the way I might have imagined during those darkest months after the betrayal. I won by becoming someone I could respect, someone who could look in the mirror and see strength instead of victimhood, someone who built something real that couldn't be taken away. The house is just wood and stone and glass. The life I built inside it, that's what matters. And that, finally, is mine in ways nothing can ever change.